The Crimson Maw descended upon the colony world of Veltrian 5 like a black tide, unstoppable, unmerciful, and unchallenged. Atmos sirens screamed as civilians scrambled for the underground shelters, their eyes flicking toward the sky as monstrous shapes blotted out the stars. Ships of polished obsidian tore through the upper atmosphere, trailing flames and screaming plasma. The elite of the galaxy's most ruthless predators had arrived, and they came not to conquer, but to feast. For over 10 millennia, the Maw had been an apex predator species, devouring entire civilizations with no remorse and no resistance that mattered. Their arrival was often the final chapter in any race's history. Until now. Commander Elias Rourke watched the spectacle from orbit, jaw tight, heart a steady war drum in his chest. His ship, the TSV Barrowclaw, was one of only 3 Terran vessels within immediate response range. And this was no diplomatic outpost. It was a mining colony with a skeletal defense grid and less than 1,000 soldiers. Not even close to enough to stop a full Maw hunting party, let alone the enormous hive barge now rising from hyperspace like a leviathan. Yet Rourke didn't blink. His voice, rough and cold as iron, cut through the silence of the command deck. "They think we're prey," he growled. "They're not ready for what happens when humans fight back. Before we jump into this epic tale, subscribe to HFY Chronicles for the most intense sci-fi battles, legendary warriors, and universe-shaking wars. Don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button and join the fight." The Galactic Conquered had long since abandoned the idea of standing up to the Crimson Maw. Too many fleets shattered, too many planets reduced to bone and glass. The Maw hunted for sport, not resources. They left nothing behind but silence and ash. But Terrans were new to this game. Recent additions to the galactic stage, yes, but forged in centuries of their own wars. Conditioned by struggle, designed, not evolved, for retaliation. The Maw had encountered dozens of races, all of whom begged, pleaded, broke. They had never met one that smiled when they bled. Elias ordered all personnel to combat readiness. Mining bots were repurposed into mobile weapons platforms, atmospheric drones loaded with thermal explosives. It was improvisation at its most desperate, and yet something in the Terran spirit shimmered under pressure. A primal instinct that had shaped them from savanna predators to interstellar tacticians. The colony had 23 minutes until full orbital saturation. That was all the time humanity needed to set the galaxy on fire. The Maw's vanguard ships screamed toward the surface, needle-like constructs of bioalloy and spiked hulls, each powered by living reactors bred for one purpose: to kill. Anti-orbital fire met them halfway, but barely dented the incoming wave. That's when Rourke gave the real order. Operation Fenrir. Stealth shuttles, previously docked and silent, dropped below radar and raced toward the enemy formation. On board, genetically, enhanced Terran shock troopers in hard suits, each one a walking warhead. Silent, calculating, and burning for revenge. These were not soldiers hoping to survive. These were the kind who had grown up watching Earth's skies lit with orbital debris from skirmishes never officially recorded. The kind whose bloodlines traced back to wars fought in trenches, jungles, and black sites on distant moons. The Maw were expecting resistance. They weren't expecting fury. They weren't expecting humans. Aboard the Maw hive barge, the alpha predator Vroxis Hakar surveyed the battlefield with a predator's certainty. His kind had conquered the Ferali star clans, erased the Orthus mindweb, and shattered the steel giants of HD 3-1-5b. He had tasted over 100 sapient species, and none had ever come close to threatening him. Now, staring down at Veltrian 5, he dismissed the Terran signals as irrelevant noise. A flick of his clawed hand sent new waves of drones to finish what had begun. But his smugness lasted exactly 47 seconds. Because that was when the Maw barge's left flank exploded. Ripped open not by orbital fire, but from within. A breach team of Terran infiltrators, having tunneled through a decoy mass relay shell, detonated a fusion core directly inside the internal transport ring. Vroxis stumbled as fire roared across the deck, screams of his elite echoing through. Bio-corridors lined with the bones of the Maw's past victories. Blood sprayed in every direction. But this time, it wasn't human blood. And through the fire, walked Elias Rourke, helmet off, rifle charged, eyes burning like twin supernovae. "This is your first mistake," he said to the nearest drone before shooting it clean through the skull. "Thinking we'd go down easy. Welcome to the real hunt." The moment Elias Rourke's boots hit the scorched deck plates of the Maw hive barge, the temperature surged to over 1700 Fahrenheit, from the ruptured plasma conduits searing through the lower corridors. His armored suit compensated instantly. Nanofoam layers expanded, absorbing heat and pressure fluctuations while recycling breathable atmosphere into his sealed helm. Through the shimmering haze and embers of molten bone metal, the unmistakable stench of Maw ichor hung thick, metallic, and rotting like copper drowned in sulfur. The scent was new. Humanity had never gotten close enough to smell a Maw alive before, let alone inside their stronghold. Behind him, his infiltration team moved in practiced formation, each soldier interlinked through neural synchronization, a technique borrowed from failed AI experiments that had been repurposed for human aggression. It gave them the edge in close-quarters warfare, allowing squadmates to move as extensions of each other's minds. The Maw didn't have that. They relied on instinct and brute power. Until now, it had been more than enough. But now, they were facing a species whose evolution had turned survival into an art of war. Rourke raised a clenched fist. The team froze. Around the corner, a Maw hunting node, 7-legged beasts with razor limbs and biocannons mounted to their torsos, clicked and hissed, scanning the smoldering deck. Their eyes glowed blue. Rourke's glowed red. One blink was all the signal his unit needed. Flashbangs detonated like miniature novas, blinding organic sensors while pulse rifles opened up in staggered bursts. Explosive rounds slammed into Maw, chitin with surgical accuracy, cracking plates that were previously thought indestructible. Screams followed, not human ones. One of the creatures lunged, massive, serpentine, impossibly fast. Rourke met it head-on, jamming the barrel of his rifle into its open mouth and firing a triple-pulse shot that blew out the back of its skull in a wet, sulfuric spray. It collapsed in a heap of twitching muscle and steaming fluids. He stood over it, breathing hard, jaw clenched. "You're not the top of the food chain anymore," he muttered. Elsewhere in orbit, the TSV Barrowclaw coordinated with the remaining Terran ships, Valkyrie and Dresden's Blade, to execute a maneuver that violated 3 interstellar war codes and the laws of basic physics. Operation Fenrir. Phase 2 wasn't about defense, it was about disruption. The Terrans used a newly developed kinetic wormhole destabilizer, an experimental device designed by human physicist Dr. Alia Voss, once considered mad by the Galactic Conquered. Her theory was simple, terrifying, and brilliant. Fold a micro-wormhole inside a gravity well, collapse it using exotic matter, and watch the implosion ripple through subspace like a glass hammer. When activated near the Maw's forward dreadnoughts, it didn't destroy them in a flash of glory. It unmade them, scrambling their gravitational signatures, collapsing their temporal cohesion, and reducing their star-forged hulls into fractal metal shards, drifting in slow-motion agony. The Maw had fought fleets. They had never fought human ingenuity weaponized by desperation and rage. Down below, in the depths of the hive barge, Rourke's team advanced, leaving a trail of shredded Maw behind them. They weren't just attacking. They were studying. Every moment of combat was streamed to Terran Command's AI arrays for real-time analysis. Every limb severed, every drone dissected, every wound inflicted. It all fed into the expanding human tactical library on Maw physiology. That was the terrifying truth. Humans didn't just fight. They learned. And they adapted faster than any species in the known galaxy. One squad member, Corporal Merrick, paused beside a steaming corridor filled with nutrient sacs, organic incubators where Maw young were gestated. He stared at the pulsing membranes, at the way they twitched and squirmed in reaction to sound. "They breed fast," he muttered through the comms. "Efficient, purpose-driven." Rourke looked at them with a soldier's clarity. "That's why we end them here. No mercy, no mythology. They're not gods. Just beasts that got too used to no one fighting back." A Maw war priest descended from the ceiling, wings of serrated cartilage, claws like blades forged from meteorite metal. Its scream echoed through the chambers like a living sonic weapon, causing Marek to stagger and vomit blood inside his helmet. Rourke didn't flinch. He activated his exosuit's magnetic anchors and surged forward with thruster bursts, slamming into the creature mid-flight. The two crashed into a wall of bone architecture, shattering decorative skulls and tearing through ancient Maw hieroglyphs. Rourke drove a carbon-edge combat blade into its throat and twisted. The scream stopped. Blood soaked the floor. Silence reigned. But it was the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Far beyond Veltrian 5, within the Maw home cluster of Inkai, alarms howled for the first time in recorded history. Their spore sentinels, biological constructs that passed information through quantum pheromones, had activated their distress protocol. The last time this had occurred was during the annihilation of the Glath Syndicate. But this time, the message wasn't one of triumph. It was panic. Humans were no longer prey. They were disruption incarnate, and still, Rourke hadn't even reached the Maw command bridge. The deeper he went, the stranger the structure became, walls pulsing with what felt like thought, lights shifting based on proximity, suggesting the ship itself was sentient in some ancient, alien way. But the humans moved forward, unshaken, because for them, fear wasn't a signal to flee. It was a motivator, a stimulant, and every time they were told you cannot win, they replied the same way: watch us. The command bridge of the Maw Hive barge was not a room in the traditional sense. It was a living cathedral, a hemispherical chamber suspended within a pulsating membrane of translucent tissue and bioluminescent veins that throbbed like a beating heart. No doors marked its entrance, no consoles or screens adorned its walls. Instead, the space responded to intent, interfacing directly with the biological signatures of Maw commanders through neural tendrils that flowed like serpents from the ceiling. Control was not issued through buttons or levers. It was sung, screamed, or willed into the hive's mind. This was a species that had fused biology and command structure into one singular breathing entity. Elias Rourke stood at its threshold, the armor on his shoulders scorched and blood-stained, his pulse rifle humming low with spent heat. Behind him, his unit held a tight formation, weapons aimed into the darkened sanctuary where the Maw warbrain resided. No one had ever made it this far. Not the Vargan mercenaries, not the Zalorian enforcers, not even the genetically perfected Vatari legions. All had been consumed. Yet here stood a Terran infiltration squad, not just surviving, but winning. As they stepped into the chamber, the floor shifted beneath their boots, flesh and metal flexing, in tandem, reacting to their presence like a disturbed hive of insects. A low groan echoed around them, the kind that resonated deep in the chest cavity and set the teeth on edge. The Maw warbrain emerged from the upper core, descending like a deity of flesh and malice. It was a massive tangle of neural tissue, armored in reflective bone plating, with dozens of crimson eyes blinking independently across its surface. Tentacles bristled with reactive spikes, each capable of splitting tanks in half. But the most terrifying thing about it wasn't its size or form, it was the silence. It didn't scream. It simply observed. Rourke raised his rifle. "This is where your empire ends." In response, the warbrain released a wave of psionic pressure so intense that the entire team staggered backward. Blood vessels in their eyes ruptured, their helmets cracking with spiderweb fractures as localized gravity inverted in pulses. One soldier, Lieutenant Corin, collapsed to his knees, nose pouring blood as neural feedback overwhelmed his implants. But they didn't retreat. Rourke reached behind his back, unhooked the device strapped to his spine, the last of the Fenrir charges. Not explosive in the traditional sense. This was a disruptor seed, seeded with synthetic dark matter and tuned to the Maw's own psionic resonance. Created in the laboratories of Luna Prime by engineers who had studied Maw prisoners for years, it was humanity's final gift to the galaxy's most feared predators. He threw the seed into the air. It hovered, spun, and pulsed a frequency that made the warbrain recoil for the first time in its existence. It had no defense against it, no protocol for such a thing. Its mind was suddenly filled with noise. Alien thought. Human thought. Randomness, chaos, improvisation. It didn't understand. It couldn't. It had ruled through dominance, not adaptation. It had evolved to command, not to counter. That was the flaw. That was the blind spot humans exploited. With a surge of determination, Rourke and his team advanced. Weapons fired in synchronized bursts, dodging writhing tendrils and cleaving through bone armor with focused beam shots. The Maw warbrain lashed out, but for every blow, the Terrans adapted. Marek leapt atop a pseudopod and emptied a plasma lance directly into one of its core eyes. Sergeant Varga rolled beneath a sweeping tentacle and activated a nanoblade that melted its way through neural junctions like fire through silk. Blood splattered, but they didn't stop, because humans didn't stop. Not when survival was on the line. Not when vengeance was within reach. In orbit, the battle had reached apocalyptic proportions. Maw destroyers swarmed the Terran ships in waves, but the humans were unpredictable. They launched drones that split into sub-drones mid-flight. They redirected enemy projectiles using experimental grav mirrors. They detonated fusion cores in dead ships to create debris clouds that disoriented Maw formations. For every Maw tactic, the Terrans didn't just counter. They rewrote the rules of engagement. Within the hive barge, the disruptor seed reached critical resonance. The chamber began to disintegrate. Walls peeled back like molted skin, shrieking, as their biological integrity unraveled. The warbrain convulsed, its psionic link to the fleet severed in a blink. Ships above faltered, Maw pilots screamed. The entire hive barge shuddered as though in agony. Rourke gave the order, evac. They ran. Through crumbling corridors, past twitching Maw corpses, over decks that boiled from failing thermal regulators. They leapt through the extraction point as the Barrowclaw punched through the atmosphere with its tractor field engaged, pulling them into orbit with just seconds to spare. Behind them, the hive barge imploded, not in fire, but in psychic collapse, its consciousness torn apart from within. For the first time in galactic history, a Maw warbrain was dead. And not from age, attrition, or internal struggle, but by human hands. Across the stars, something shifted. The predator race that had ruled for millennia, that had never tasted fear, now knew what it meant to be hunted. Because humans didn't conquer by size. They conquered by impossibility, by refusing to quit, by seeing the worst, adapting and weaponizing hope in the darkest corners of space. The galaxy trembled, and the Maw, those eternal monsters, realized something they had never considered possible. They had picked a fight with the wrong species. The aftermath of the battle reverberated throughout the galaxy, a seismic shockwave of uncertainty and awe that rippled across every star system. The Maw, once an unstoppable force of nature, was reeling, its pride shattered, its fleet scattered, and its warbrain destroyed by something it never anticipated: humanity's relentless ingenuity. The revelation spread like wildfire among the galactic factions. Fear was no longer the currency of power. Humans had become a force. As the Maw retreated into the shadows of their deep space sanctuaries, countless species watched from the sidelines. Some with dread, others with intrigue, but none dared challenge the Terran Empire, at least not yet. Rourke and his team returned to the Terran capital, where the mood was one of quiet triumph. No celebratory parades, no confetti. The victory was too enormous to fully comprehend. Humanity had taken down a godlike predator, but they had also revealed something far darker, an unspoken truth about the universe. No matter how advanced, no matter how unstoppable a species may seem, they were not invincible. Rourke knew this, more than anyone. He had seen it firsthand, the terror in the Maw's eyes as they were driven to the edge of extinction, and he understood what that meant for the future. As the days passed, the Terran government began to make its move. The warships that had been assembled for humanity's defense now found a new purpose: offense. No longer would humans be a fringe species, hidden in the far reaches of space, clinging to a fragile existence. They would become the apex predators, the hunters, and the galaxy's worst nightmare. The political landscape shifted dramatically. Alliances were forged, while old enemies quivered in the shadow of humanity's rising power. A fleet that once operated in isolation now moved in force, united, coordinated, and deadly. Yet, as much as Rourke relished the idea of humanity asserting itself, He could not shake the feeling of unease that gnawed at him. The victory over the Maw had been monumental, but it had come at a steep price. Thousands had died, both on the battlefield and in the diplomatic maneuvering that followed. The world had changed, but the galaxy was still a dangerous place, filled with beings far more lethal and intelligent than anyone had ever imagined. It was in the hushed corridors of the capital that Rourke met with General Cassia Darnell, a seasoned officer whose piercing gaze had seen more horrors than most could fathom. They sat across from each other in a sterile, dimly lit conference room, the hum of artificial gravity the only sound that broke the silence. "Do you ever wonder what the Maw saw in us?" Cassia asked, her voice low, as if she were considering something beyond the immediate future. Rourke took a moment before answering, his mind drifting back to the chaos of that final battle. "They saw weakness. They thought we were just another species ripe for the picking. But they were wrong." "No," she said, her voice colder now. "They didn't just see weakness. They saw potential, the kind that frightens them, the kind they never anticipated." It was then that Rourke realized the full gravity of what had just occurred. The Maw had seen humanity's potential to evolve, to adapt, to overcome. And that was exactly what made them so terrifying. Unlike the Maw, who had built an empire on psychic dominance and overwhelming force, humanity had built its power on unpredictability. The key to their victory was never in numbers, firepower, or raw strength. It was their ability to adapt to every obstacle thrown in their way. They were a species that had learned to fight with improvisation, to outthink and outmaneuver their opponents, even when faced with impossible odds. But the galaxy was not without its defenders. Across the stars there were whispers of the humans' sudden rise. The Jakar, an ancient race of sentient insectoid beings known for their ruthless precision and mastery of biological warfare, had already started to stir. The Skaraxis, a race of hyper-intelligent telepaths who had once ruled vast swaths of the galactic underworld, were now organizing, making strategic moves that suggested they knew something the humans didn't. And the Zalorian Syndicate, with their vast armies of genetically engineered soldiers and their covert espionage networks, had begun to move resources into position, preparing for a confrontation they knew was coming. It wasn't just about domination anymore. Humanity had crossed the threshold. They had become a power that couldn't be ignored, a challenge that could no longer be brushed aside. There were species in the galaxy who had thrived by maintaining the balance of power, where predators remained the rulers of space. Now, with the rise of humanity, that balance was shattered. And in the shadows, the predators who once felt untouchable were preparing for the storm that was about to engulf them. Rourke could feel the weight of it all. He had been there from the beginning, when humanity was still crawling into the vastness of the galaxy, struggling to make its mark. Now, the tides had shifted. The universe had become a far more dangerous place, but it had also become a place of possibility. The rules were no longer set in stone. The game had changed, and humanity was now playing by its own. The question remained, would humanity's newfound power lead them to greatness, or would they become the next in a long line of failed empires? The galaxy had seen civilizations rise and fall, some more advanced than humans, others far older. But none had been as resilient. None had understood the power of adaptation as deeply as humanity did. As the Terran ships prepared for their next mission, deep within the heart of the galaxy, Rourke couldn't help but feel the weight of destiny. Humanity had shown the galaxy its fangs. But the question was, how long would it be before the galaxy came for humanity, with its own teeth bared? The final days of peace were rapidly slipping away. Humanity had proved itself capable of standing tall against the galaxy's fiercest predators. But the victory had planted the seeds of something far more dangerous. A new age of interstellar war. Every power in the galaxy knew that the Terran Empire was no longer to be underestimated. A dangerous shift had occurred in the fabric of galactic politics. The mere existence of humanity, its rise from a fragile species to a fearsome force, had rewritten the rules of the universe. The predators who once ruled from the shadows were now on edge, realizing their dominance had been permanently shaken. Rourke stood on the bridge of the Resolute, his flagship, watching the stars streak past as the ship drifted through the darkened expanse of the Siphus Nebula. The stars themselves seemed distant, almost unreachable, like the lives of the billions who had trusted humanity's war machine to protect them. In this cold, unforgiving corner of space, he could feel the weight of every decision. The galaxy had changed, and with it, so had humanity's role. They were no longer passive observers, trying to survive in the void. They had become players, and players often became targets. But no matter how cold and distant space seemed, Rourke knew there was one immutable truth in this new age. The galaxy was a playground for the strong, and humanity had learned to fight like no one had ever imagined. They had the technology, the tactical ingenuity, and the sheer willpower to outlast the most formidable foes. Yet, despite their newfound strength, a creeping sense of foreboding gnawed at the edges of Rourke's mind. What would the galaxy's powers do now? Would they band together in fear, seeking to suppress humanity's rise? Or would they launch the first strike, trying to push the Terran Empire back into the obscurity it had come from? The question was answered when the first attack came, swift and brutal. The Jacquard, a race known for their hive-minded military tactics and biomechanical warships, launched an unprovoked assault on a Terran mining colony on the fringes of the Serpentis Expanse. It wasn't just a declaration of war, it was a calculated move. The Jacquard had always believed themselves the apex predators, but now they faced a different kind of enemy. The Terran military response was immediate and decisive. Rourke stood before the war table, watching as the fleet's strategy unfolded on the holographic display. He knew the Jacquard were counting on their overwhelming numbers and biological warfare to destabilize humanity's resolve, but they had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated the Terran penchant for surprise. The humans had long understood the power of information warfare, and this was the first weapon they would use against the Jacquard. Within hours, the Terran ships were in position, their stealth systems cloaking them from the Jacquard's sensors. The fleet moved with precision, a deadly ballet of digital warfare and military might. The first few hours of combat were a blur of tactical maneuvers and electronic jamming as Terran ships slashed through the Jacquard's heavily armored fleets, crippling their coordination before they could even strike a blow. The battle raged, on for days, and the outcome was inevitable. As the Terran forces annihilated wave after wave of Jacquard warships, Rourke's thoughts turned inward. The stakes were higher than ever. The Terran Empire had emerged victorious, but at what cost? Thousands of Terran soldiers had perished in the brutal, high-stakes clash. And while the galaxy had learned to fear humanity's firepower, Rourke knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The Jacquard had been only the first of many. There were others in the galaxy, even more dangerous, more cunning, and with motives far less predictable. The question lingered. Was humanity ready to become the galaxy's new rulers? Or was the Terran Empire simply the next in a long line of fallen civilizations, doomed by their own ambition and the galaxy's inexorable cycle of violence? What had begun as an act of survival was now spiraling into a series of calculated wars, each more dangerous than the last. Rourke knew the cost of peace. He had seen it in the faces of the soldiers, the families, the civilians who had lost loved ones in the wake of the First Interstellar War. Victory had its price. Every success made humanity more powerful, but it also made them a target. The other species in the galaxy had seen what humans could do when pushed to the brink, and now they would come. The predators who had once ruled, the stars would rise to challenge the Terran Empire's dominance, and humanity would be forced to fight them again. But this time, the stakes were different. The battles would no longer be fought in the cold silence of space, where weapons of mass destruction could obliterate entire planets. This time, the war would be fought on the ground, where the heart of humanity's strength lay, not just in their technology or their fleets, but in their spirit. The Jacquard had learned that lesson the hard way. They had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt and survive, to fight with heart and determination. And that was something no warship, no army, no fleet could ever replicate. As Rourke gazed out into the vastness of space, a strange calm washed over him. He understood now. The galaxy wasn't just a battlefield. It was a proving ground. A place where the strong would survive and the weak would perish. And humanity had proven itself stronger than any of them. But the war wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The predators would come, and humanity would face them head-on, with fire and fury in their hearts, because this was the new age of galactic warfare, the age of the human hunter, and the galaxy would never be the same again.